All right, everyone. Thank you for taking your seats. We're going to resume. My name is Jerome Chou. I'm Director of Competitions at Van Alen Institute. And I'm going to steal 60 seconds from our lunchtime just to make two quick editorial comments. First, just to reiterate something that David mentioned in his presentation, that we at Van Alen and at Architectural Record are deeply grateful for the 1,414 designers who took the survey and took time and gave us such funny, insightful, passionate responses. Just as we were reading literally hundreds and hundreds of responses, it really struck us the collective and hard-earned wisdom and experience represented in that content. So just a thank you. That said, designers will kind of recede into the background in the next two case studies. The first, the 11th Street Bridge competition in DC, and the second, Kendall Square Connect right here in Cambridge, as we hear from some of the other stakeholders, city official, nonprofit organizer, community advocate, and yes, even a juror. So with that, let me welcome Scott Kratz, who is the director of the 11th Street Bridge Park Project, and David Smith, who is the executive director of Pearl Coalition, who will be our first two panelists.
Good morning, everyone. Here we go. So my name is Scott Kratz. I'm the director of the 11th Street Bridge Park. The 11th Street Bridge Park is a collaboration between the district government in Washington, D.C., and the nonprofit that I work for, appropriately called Building Bridges Across the River at the Arc. And what I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes is talk a little bit about the project, give us a really quick overview. Talk then about the design competition that we had last year. We spent most of last year working on, with a particular emphasis on how we engage the community at every step of the way. And then finish with the next steps, sort of where are we now and where are we going. But I wanted to start on sort of a macro level that increasingly, cities are being defined by their civic spaces, right? And increasingly, cities are looking at inventive ways to use age-out infrastructure into those new civic spaces to build social capital. And I've turned into a little bit of a bridge geek, working on this project. It's amazing how many transformed bridges there are across the United States. The old, aged-out railroad tracks or freeway bridges in Chattanooga, the Shelby Street Bridge in Nashville, perhaps the best-named bridge, the Purple People Bridge, Purple People Mover Bridge in Cincinnati that connects actually two different states. The point is that, and of course, the probably best known example is the High Line in New York City, that the Bridge Park's been compared to a lot, but although lots to learn from, but very different projects. The point is that this is happening around the United States, and it's really fascinating too, thinking about how all of these the projects have also followed another trend in city design of re-engaging waterfronts. And I think that's really interesting because Washington, D.C., and our nation's capital, was one of the main reasons why it was founded as the nation's capital, was because it was at the intersection of two different rivers, the Potomac and the eastern branch of the Potomac, now what we know is the Anacostia, and yet we don't really define ourselves as a river city, which I think is really fascinating. So frame of reference, this is the L'Enfant plan from several centuries ago. Capitol sort of right in the middle. That pink bar is where the 11th Street Bridge Park is. And a deeper dive shows where the bridges are, cross the Anacostia River and connect the neighborhoods of Capitol Hill and the Navy Yard with historic Anacostia and Fair Lawn, two very different neighborhoods. The river has been a dividing line for generations in the city. And the reason why we started on this project is because we had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity where old freeway bridges that crossed over the river had aged out and needed to be replaced. And we saw this as a wonderful opportunity, instead of getting rid of all the old infrastructure, of repurpose part of it to make this new civic space. And what you're looking at here in the bottom left-hand corner is the U.S. Navy Yard, one of the oldest Navy Yards in the United States. The Anacostia Park, a National Park Service property on your right-hand side. This is an image of the old spans and the new spans on a single image. So the orange and light gray spans at the top of the bottom are bridges built in the 1960s. They aged out. Those two were replaced with 3 new bridges. Those are the dark gray bands in the center. We're most interested in the bottom 2 spans. The light gray, or the dark gray at the bottom, is the new local bridge. That 2 things to point out about that local bridge. It has a 16-foot wide pedestrian and bike path that's already done a nice job of connecting both sides of the river. It was also built to hold the streetcar, which is a few years down the road. And that's important because for this project to work, we need to make sure it's deeply stitched into the adjacent neighborhoods. But the orange span is that old span of the bridge that we're looking at repurposing. We tried to see how much of the entire bridge we could save to start. We thought that the green deck had a beautiful industrial patina to it. Most people thought it was really hideous and really ugly. But more importantly, and I've learned more about bridge engineering than I ever thought I would want to know, it would have been cost prohibitive to save the deck. So the deck has been removed. But what I've also discovered is that one of the most expensive parts about building any river bridge is not necessarily the deck, it's the piers that hold all the load, right? The live load and the dead load. The piers are in great shape. So we're reusing the old piers to build a new deck that's on top, but no longer has to hold cars, but that can hold park space, amphitheaters, and so forth. So 4 key goals for this project. These are the 4 table legs that the entire project stands on. The public health is critically important, creating a safe place for active recreation, re-engaging residents with this amazing natural resource of the Anacostia River for too long has been hiding in plain sight, connecting to disconnected communities, and becoming an anchor for economic opportunity. And we started this project by listening to the community for 2 years. We had 2 years of meeting with members of the community, and to date we've had a little more than 500 meetings with members of the community, so really extensive outreach. Asking many different folks, whether it's workshops with local teens helping to design the space, but one asking, is this something that the community wants? And I think that's really important. We were really asking for permission. And I think that's particularly true given the communities that we're working with that has a legacy of the justifiable skepticism. And 2, well, okay, if the answer is yes, which it was, what kind of programming should we put on this bridge? And interestingly, we heard the same program suggestions from residents on both sides of the river, which is a little surprising. That might have been shared in different ways. And then it was our job to take these 2 years of listening sessions and all of these programming ideas and then work with the design community to manifest those into a final design solution. So we kicked off a nationwide design competition last year, about almost a year ago. It was a 3-stage design competition. We brought in the design competition advisor, Don Stastny, who was extraordinarily helpful in shaping the project. And what was most important, I think, for this entire project that David will be speaking about in just a minute, is since it had been such a community-driven process from the beginning, how do we make sure that the community continued to play a key role as part of this design process? So we created what we call the Design Oversight Committee, representing the stakeholders from both sides of the river and around the city that did several different things. They reviewed the design brief before it went out to the public. That was really important. They met with the 4 final design teams multiple times over the summer to continue to shape the project. And then at the end, they used the same criteria as the jury did to evaluate the 4 final designs. And we were working with some of the best designers in the country we were so humbled to be working with. And we had exhibitions around town. We had very public presentations. It was a very public and transparent process. And at the end, the most amazing thing happened where the jury was unanimous, our group of design oversight committee, community stakeholders was unanimous, and even 1,100 people who filled out an online survey, well, they weren't unanimous because that would have been weird, right? But they agreed as well on the winning design, which was by Alen. It was a brilliant design, using building a very simple truss system on top of the old piers that meets in the center to provide this sort of center gathering place. And as they described it, their concept was this notion of crossing that was indeed inspired by that original design by Pierre L'Enfant and Benjamin Banneker, there's lots of icons in Washington, D.C. that are federal, but not many that respond to the local resident. So recognizing this is a very ambitious slide, right? Taking its place along all these icons, but you got to think big if you're building a bridge. But that was important. And it was important to make sure that this very exciting idea that was relatively ephemeral now has something that people can look and taste and touch. And most importantly, that the community felt incredible ownership over this process throughout. And so it's, from a very simple standpoint, these two planes that come together and meet. Water plays a very sort of key role because we are over the river. Embracing the rich history of the region. Frederick Douglass used to walk across the 11th Street Bridge every single day on his way to work. Using water to actually physically clean the water. Manifesting those community-driven programming ideas like an environmental education center. Programming sort of throughout the space, including performance spaces, cafe, restaurant, and all of this to connect these two otherwise disconnected, the assets and cultural assets that are on both sides of the river, connecting them and making a physical and metaphorical bridge. For phenomenal views that are up there too, that actually get you high enough to see the Washington Monument. It's going to be amazing for 4th of July. Someone asked me the other day, and then I'll go through the last couple slides of sort of how do we know we've been successful? And I think there's lots of measures of success, but I think if we're really successful, a fourth grader in historic Anacostia who've never been down to the river before because there's an 8-lane concrete highway that's separated him from the river can come down and experience this natural resource. If a neighbor of mine, I live in Capitol Hill, can come down to the river and experience the amazing natural ecosystem that's there, I think that's a success. And I think most importantly, if that fourth grader from historic Anacostia and that neighbor of mine in Capitol Hill can come down and share a moment together in a conversation, that's when we know we've really been successful. So we're continuing our community engagement. I'm out there meeting with residents at least 2 or 3 times a week, giving regular updates. I think the most important sort of takeaway is that this is all about building relationships and building trust. And we found no shortcut to building those trusts than shared experiences over time. And those relationships need constant care and nurturing. And that's why we're out in the community all the time. And just last week, I'll close with this, we partnered with the National Park Service to hold this huge festival down by the water to get people excited about this idea. We had 5,000 or 6,000 people show up. It was a tremendous success that in a single day can be what the future Bridge Park will be 365 days out of the year. But most importantly, more than the numbers that were there, it was who came. And I stood up there on stage and looked out, and it was Washington, D.C. It was every single corner of Washington, D.C. in the larger region, and that gave us a tremendous amount of hope that this can be a success. So with that, David.
Good morning. So let me just give you an idea of before I start my presentation, that my presentation is deliberately designed to share a perspective of a juror and a community member and a nonprofit partner and a former riverkeeper. And so I was selected for that purpose. I'm actually the director of a nonprofit organization called the Pearl Coalition. And our mission is to highlight the history, the untold histories of Washington, D.C., specifically how African Americans and other races work together in the pursuit for freedom. You'd be surprised at the amount of activity that happened around the Anacostia River. So with that said, I wanted to share a little bit about my professional background to give you an indication of the political ramifications, because I was a political appointment, which typically is something I frown upon. But as the executive director of the Pearl, I was then politically appointed. I had to get permission from my community, literally based on our very old practices of being afraid of your grandmother. 11th Street Bridge Design Oversight Committee member. I'm also a Dean with Citizens Association president, which is a historic community, one of the oldest African-American historic communities in the nation related to its formation of this particular organization. I'm also a VP of a community-based land trust that we created in order to preserve our lands, to confront the tide of the kind of the displacement and gentrification is happening. I'm also a former riverkeeper and a creative placemaker by virtue of my professional background. So let's talk about the Community Oversight Committee. When I first got the call, I actually was former council member Marion Berry asked me to do it. He has a very, Marion Berry, if you're not from DC, you have I'm sure you form your opinions about him. But one thing we know is that he cares about the people and among other things that he's passionate about. So when he asked me, I was honored. I still was skeptical. A couple other council members asked me, David Grasso asked me, and I said, okay, let me consider it. And he said, well, talk to Scott. And I called Scott and I gave him a berate. Basically, I'm a 6th generation Washingtonian, and I didn't want to be connected to a project that eventually would displace the people I represent. And and I just went on and on about it. The city has a very notorious reputation of trick bag. That's what we call it, trick bag. They come in and say, look what we're doing. And the whole time their hand is in your pocket, right? And we looked at the design competition as potentially another one of those opportunities. And I'll be very frank about it. We have community-based talent, and we have very few architectural firms in our community, which is true. And we don't have the capacity to compete on a national level based on community, but there's been no investment into that capacity. So of course we wouldn't be competitive. So with that, I approached it based on my conversations with these politicians who appointed me and my community members, and they had told me I had to go in and be the bad cop, which I did not want to do because I want to just raise money for my project, right? Being bad cop often separates you from that possibility, and they're very difficult conversations that make folk uncomfortable. So my conversation with Scott kind of convinced me that I had to be a part of this, if nothing else, to make sure at the end of the process that the community was fully involved and informed. But I was shocked to say that Scott had already done the kind of work that I would have expected to be done in order to create an inclusive project. His community meetings were multiple. Everyone I talked to had either already attended the meeting or had personal meetings with Scott and his team, which was shocking. It was a leadership as a whole. There wasn't one particular agency or discipline that wasn't at the table. Community stakeholders, old gatekeepers, people who know everything to people who didn't know anything were involved and invested. And so when I say vested, I mean have a personal stake in that tree because their grandma planted the tree. So vested. They don't, no political interest, no economic interest, just I want to protect that tree. That sort of heart for the project. And schools and churches were involved at the very beginning. So that made my job easy as I joined the committee. I went the wrong way. So here's just some pictures that I think Scott shared also on his slide, but I made sure I put them in of some of the people. We have the artist community. We have some of the activists and ANCs, which are the equivalent to a state rep and people who have votes. We don't have votes in DC. I thought I'd throw that out there. To community stakeholders who just love to see progress. So what compelled me to kind of sit back in my seat and not just kind of berate the entire process was the core values. The core values from the very beginning, and this is my reinterpretation of them, and Scott has them detailed, so get them from him if you need them, but the community stakeholders really infused the process. Scott sent out what he thought the core values should be based on his community meetings, and we took weeks poring over each principle to say, hey, you know what, that's great, but what about this? That's great, what about that? And we came to a consensus before we met as an advisory committee. And each of us are from different communities, so those core values were represented. So we felt good about that. And one of the most important things is that we didn't look at the dilapidation of the community from a negative perspective, but from an asset-based approach. It was inclusive, diverse, and transparency was critical, especially for the reputations of the folk like myself who have been, who is critical. We have to represent the community despite our own personal interests. So transparency made that very easy. I could answer questions in a very non-political way. DC is everything is political. So transparency and ongoing communication made it possible for folk to feel comfortable with the level of integrity of the process. And those real-time updates made a huge difference. So the steering committee, who were the steering committee? They were experts that ranged. You name it, we had them. My favorite example of the two experts was the structural engineer and the architect, who always sat together and argued the entire meeting. Then you have folk from the Navy Yard. So we just had a horrible incident at the Navy Yard. So her job, and it was clear to us, and we would laugh when she made these comments because she had an agenda. Her job was to make sure that it was safe. So all she cared about was line of sight from the bridge, line of sight from the bridge. If you build that, line of sight, line of sight. And then you have folk from the rowing club. They didn't care about the bridge. All they wanted to make sure was the lanes were open for boats. So then, and being a former river keeper and this community activist, I got to figure out how to put my agenda in with the boat, but I could very seldomly get there. So what I did push from my perspective was always the arts, creative economy, and the history being infused in the bridge. And Scott knows I actually wanted carved history in the actual structure of the bridge to ensure that in 100 years it wouldn't change. You know, I kind of like the Egyptian style of hieroglyphics, so we can make sure we capture our community history in a permanent manner. But at the end of the process, I think everybody came out satisfied. So we really designed that process. Now, I heard some comments about the expense from the architectural firm, but let me assure you, as committee members, it was an expense. You know, we had to get there. This is just a short example of some time allotment. We spent 2 days in the design process, talking about over 30 people from various agencies, from Park Service to Department of Planning, nonprofit leaders. And as a nonprofit exec, whenever we do free work, we really do free work, okay? So 2-day interview process. So once these teams were selected, we just gave them, we gave it to them. They asked great questions, and we provided them with the most toughest form of answers that we could get. And we had these rules, thanks to Dawn. We could say high risk and low risk, which we found hilarious. And of course, some folk would just go straight around that and just go, no, you know. But for the most part, most folk were very cordial and participatory in that process and followed the rules. So this is an example I also stole from the 11th Street Bridge participation, and I feel like this is a win for me. Keep in mind, we all had our agendas when we went to the table. We want community involved. So having Frederick Douglass displayed on the bridge was the win for me. And for the community. So how did the bridge accomplish the major goal based on what I was told I had to do from former council member Berry and Grasso and the Deanwood community, Anacostia community? Well, folk came together. And I figured I would just take this opportunity to plug the Pearl to give you an indication as if it's 36 organizations. My example is true to all the other community-based organizations and nonprofit and educational-based organizations in the community. There was such synergy. For instance, the Pearl Escape happened. The people that participated in that escape worked with Frederick Douglass. So there was some natural synergy there. The history and the cultural programming in the community was critical. Art and creative economy, the bridge would create. The relationships within these organizations, since there were 36 organizations, the community was already connected. So the natural connections were there, and I think that was the most critical piece. And here you can see Frederick Douglass, for instance, here with the Edmondson girls. That's Sumner. And this is in New York City. So even New York is connected to the 11th Street Bridge. So we're going to do a good job. Scott and I are going to work about how we're going to connect the nation to this story. Just some amazing history. So I like to use this picture as the L'Enfant, but what about Benjamin Banneker, who did the work? So that's something that a Washingtonian would say, so I'll make sure I say it here. But this map has always bothered us, and it bothers us because can you really see the east side of that river? So when you come to D.C. as a tourist, that's the map you get really without the community in which I live. So we saw that as an opportunity. So this is the new map. So now you see we're starting to highlight our green spaces. We're really starting to look at our community from an assets perspective. We plan on pulling those tourists off the National Mall and generating revenue and income. I'm slightly over my time, so I'm going to speed up. And I'm going to get down to this last point, arts hubs, small business enterprise zones. That's what's necessary to restore communities that are disenfranchised, and we see the bridge as an opportunity to accomplish that. So this is the 11th Street Bridge. You saw that image, and to the left there is my favorite piece of the bridge, which will be the boat that'll be pulled up to that bridge eventually to teach people about history and connecting the community. But more importantly, folk will have an economic opportunity to participate from the community so they can stay once the bridge is built. Thank you.
So thank you both for your presentations. A couple of things are very clear to me, and then one thing is less clear to me, and hopefully you guys will help tease that out. What's clear is the project was a huge success by any number of measures that you've defined. And it was an unusual competition in a bunch of ways, and we'll come back to that. What's not clear to me is, could you have gotten a similar result? The kind of engagement you had, the kind of difficult conversations you had, the ways you were able to insert art and culture and history into this project. Could you have gotten that result without a design competition? If you had just launched, let's say, a planning process with OMA as the lead, and you'd taken the same steps to make sure people were listened to, people had a stake, people had ownership in the process, could you have come up with a similar outcome?
I don't think so. I think just by selecting who that sort of team would have been, wouldn't have given the same ownership over this entire process. And I think again, it's really important to emphasize that mistrust, right, that's in the community, and completely justifiable mistrust, because people have come into to the community again and again and made all sorts of promises, and then those get value engineered out, or they never meant to complete those promises to begin with. And I think if we would have come in with something, even if a design hadn't been created, but these are the people we're working with, and it wasn't this open and transparent process, I think that would have been a giant step backwards. I don't think and I think it was, I think what's interesting about the design competition is ultimately we were hoping for a design solution, right? I mean, that was sort of the simplest reason sort of why we were going through it, to take these community-inspired programming ideas and manifest them into a compelling design. But I think what was most interesting to us anyways is that the ancillary, the results that came out of that design competition process, that now we have these 36 or so stakeholders representing tens of thousands of different residents that have so much ownership over this process because they helped select it. And I think most importantly, by going through that iterative process, each of the 4 different design teams' final submissions had the design oversight committee's fingerprints all over it. And I think, actually I'm confident in having the conversations with each of the design teams, even the 3 that didn't win, that they recognized how difficult that was, but how incredibly valuable that was.
And I would tend to agree with Scott. It would not have been successful in our community based on other projects. We had another project right up the street that did not use the competition. It had a great design, a great outcome related to the facility, but the community, it's a struggle to get the community involved. This process has also allowed the community to be completely aware. We drove what we wanted, and it was included in those principles. So now everyone's excited about, now we know how to take advantage of the economic opportunity and the environmental education opportunities and so many other things, that because we were engaged from the very beginning, which is the opposite. So the trust and the relationships that were built through the process, to me, are more important than the design. So we really as a community walked away, we're ready to walk away from the process and tell Scott, great job, before we even had a design, because the process was so informative and inclusive. It was different than what we've seen in 30 years. So. Right.
I forgot to tell you guys you didn't have to say it was because of the design competition, but you chose to. One thing we talked about before the panel was, is this process replicable? Because you don't see a whole lot of competitions where you meet with stakeholders, residents, business owners, church leaders for 2 years before you even put the thing out there. And I've been told, Scott, that you're a very gifted fundraiser. Where can we find the money to fund that kind of process? And you heard also from everyone from David at our nonprofit to Scott at the federal government level. we want to be able to pay designers better. But again, how do we find the funding? How do we make the case that we actually need a larger pot to start with to do a better process from the designer to the community to, down the line? And this question for both of you too.
Well, the 2 years of listening, so I had a full-time job. I was the vice president of education at the National Building Museum, and this was I clearly had too much free time on my hands project, because I worked 50, 60 hours a week at the Building Museum, and then nights and weekends, I'd go out to listen to the community. It really didn't cost any money, right? It cost a lot of time, and that, of course, is valuable. At least I'd like to think so. Do people need to take a whole 2 years to do that? Perhaps not. In our case, I think it was really valuable, and I think there wasn't a way to speed that up either. I got a phone call a few weeks ago from somebody who was planning on running a design competition and asked for our advice and said, I understand you ran a successful design competition. What can we learn? And so, yeah, sure, happy to talk to you. And so I said the very first question was, well, can you tell me about your community engagement process? And he said, oh no, we need, it's so important for fundraising to get that design out there so we have something to fundraise for. And so we're going to do that at the end of the process. And I sort of took a deep breath and I said, so this is not the news you're going to want to hear, but that's totally the wrong thing to do. Now, do you have to spend 2 years doing that? Perhaps not, but it's pay now or pay later, right? Make that investment now or have the potential of running into a community buzzsaw of opposition that I think there's lots of examples that we can turn to, right? And then the person on the phone sort of took a deep breath and said, okay. That was the critically important part of the process.
And from a community perspective, related to fundraising, it's politics. So we won it as a community. It took Scott probably a year into that second year before we got it as a community. And I say we, just try to represent the folk that I represent. I don't think folk really got it. By about the year and a half point, folk recognized the economic benefits for taxes. DC has a very interesting situation where we're actually receiving surpluses, but no matter how much surplus money we get, it's always spent, right? So once the community was aware, so now we're ready if Scott calls any of us to go, I need more money, or we need to make sure we get the money in the budget. As a community, it's not a sale. We can just call our council person, call the mayor, and make sure that money is there. And the development community also is completely cognizant of the multiplying effect of the bridge. Right. So they want that visitation. They want that visibility. The amount of people that is going to come to that bridge equals retail money for the business that will lease their spaces. So selling that now is not, Scott doesn't have to do all the work on his own anymore. Right. As a community, we see the economic opportunity and educational opportunity, so we push it. So that's, and even from the nonprofit side, it benefits even our nonprofit organization.
And I'd say that they're linked, right? I mean, the two questions that I get when I'm out there fundraising for this project, and the city recently made last year a $14.5 million commitment. And now we're cultivating having a successful time cultivating some larger donors. Is one question is where's the community on this, right? And we can say that and not only that the community is behind it, but we can sort of tick off the ways that we've been engaging the community and having them drive it is really important. And then the second question funders ask is where are the politicos on this, right? And now that just to underline David's point, we have this sort of army of champions that's out there that that wants this just as much as I do, or the Office of Planning, or sort of others. And that is critically important to leverage.
How much time do we have left? Oh, 1 minute. I was going to ask two more questions, but we should just chat about the weather. We've only got 60 seconds. So I'll just run over a little bit. I'm very interested by the comments you both made that, if Scott picks up the phone, you guys are ready, whether that's in a fundraising context or in any number of contexts. And what you just said about now you've got this army of constituents that are backing this project, but maybe also mobilized to do other things. And I'm curious about the role that design competitions could play as catalysts or as tools for community organizing, and how you see, if that was the case here, and if you see the potential for that to happen in other communities.
I do. So the moment that this competition was over, I had to then present it in a community meeting that I'm the president of my community organization. And one of the seniors stood up, who was a former teacher, and the first thing she said to me, which is all she does is point out what you didn't do, is why didn't our STEAM programs participate in the design competition and have internships and mentorships if it's public money? And I was like, ooh, I missed that. I should have said it, but we can't come up with everything. So the competition broadened the community's perspective on how we could interact in these competitions and bring this worldwide information to community-based schools to help them engage in the process. So there's a million ways you can make those links, from environmental issues to education to jobs to economics, and it's just a matter of having the forethought and the intentionality of planning that into your process.
I just add to that, the Design Oversight Committee was so important and so successful that we've been spending the last 6 to 8 months recognizing that signature civic spaces increase property values nearby, right, by anywhere from 5 to 40%, or in the Highlines case, 103%, right? That's a good thing, but a really complicated thing. We've created a larger equitable development task force, thinking early about putting in a plan in place to ensure that the thousands of people that have shaped this project can be the ones that benefit from it. And the very first group we turned to help us strategize what this might be, along with senior scholars at the Urban Institute and DC Fiscal Policy Institute and others, was the Design Oversight Committee. So actually we're meeting next Friday to help sort of think about, help continue to play that role in shaping it. And I think that process, and I think the last thing I'll say is that those community relations, it's not like you've got a community relationship check. Each of those takes constant nurturing, the care, and constant updates. And it takes a tremendous amount of capacity, but without it, we wouldn't be where we are today.
So I do want to come back to this issue about displacement, because again, it's very rare for a competition, which usually is all about let's build this, whatever, to also think about actually what's going to be the long-term consequences of that. But let's save that. Maybe we can have that as a group discussion with the other panelists. So thank you two very much. So let me now welcome the final two panelists in our last case study before we break for lunch for Connect Kendall Square here in Cambridge. Taha Jennings, Assistant to the City Manager, City of Cambridge, and Inga Saffron, Architecture Critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Welcome both of you.
Thank you. Excuse me. My name is Taha Jennings. I work in the City of Cambridge, and over the past several months, I had been involved in Connect Kendall Square, which was an open space planning competition for Eastern Cambridge and Kendall Square, which concluded just a couple of weeks ago. A submission by Richard Burke Associates based in Somerville was selected as the winning plan, and we'll be working with Burke Associates over the next couple of months in refining that plan, and I'll talk a little bit more about that process later. I just wanted to talk briefly about what it was like from the city's perspective sponsoring a competition such as this. And I will be brief, so if there are certain things that seem like they're missing from the presentation, it's probably because they are. But hopefully I could fill in any gaps during the Q&A and moderated sessions. So the question of why the city decided to undertake a competition for this process, and I thought about this a little, and I really struggled to come up with an exact answer. Even among competitions, I think the situation here was a little bit different, because we had a planning process for the area and even an open space planning process for the area well underway before a decision was made to undergo a actual competition to get the results that we wanted. We knew we had a complex problem that we wanted to look at. We were looking at using open space and the public realm to help create a sense of place and identity in the area. And we thought that Kendall Square really deserved that level of thought and thinking about it. But it really basically came down to the opportunity presenting itself, the timing, and us as staff in the city being ready to move forward quickly with that idea. While there's no one specific answer to why the City of Cambridge did a open space planning competition here, I think it's still important to understand the context of where the city was in terms of planning in the Kendall Square area. Many of you are probably familiar with some of the fairly recent changes that have been going on in Kendall Square over the past several years and in some cases even decades. I grew up in Cambridge, so I can remember as a kid wondering, where is Kendall Square? And even when I was a little older, wondering, why does this place even have a red line stop? But of course now you have new buildings, new companies in the area, you have a lot of redevelopment in the area and on underutilized sites. You have residential uses, which was almost unheard of not too long ago. You actually start to see people on the street after 5 p.m. Going to restaurants with cool-sounding names. And in the midst of all this, growth and activity, the city of Cambridge began a separate comprehensive planning study of Kendall Square, called the K2 study for short. And that started in about 2011 to really develop an overall vision for the area and plan for the additional growth that was anticipated. But some important things came out of that study regarding open space and the public realm. It was recognized that Kendall Square, as a result of some of the growth and private investment and existing resources, actually had some nice open space features, but they weren't necessarily connected in a way that worked best for the area. Also, the public realm in itself was really a key element in creating the sense of place and identity that people really wanted to see in Kendall Square, but the area had seemed to lack for so long. So around the same time, as a result of agreements with property owners and major developers in the area, the city was in a position to acquire both land and funding for the design and construction of over 5 acres of new public open space in the area, primarily at 4 locations right in Kendall Square. So this really provided an ideal opportunity to begin thinking about the open space comprehensively in the area and think about how to integrate these new open spaces into the existing open space system and create a whole network that served a variety of users, was well connected, managed, and programmed, and really provided a range of experiences and environments. As part of this open space planning process, a study committee was appointed in 2013. The study committee was made up of residents with different perspectives and connections to the area, both employees, people who lived in the area, people from the adjacent residential neighborhoods, people who worked at some of the institutions in the area. But still, building on the previous planning study, the city was really looking into making Kendall Square into more of a place and help build and reinforce an identity for the area. We wanted ideas on how to do this. So we came to the conclusion that we're looking for more than just an open space plan. We really wanted a framework for making decisions into the future. Decisions about open space design, but also about programming, about activating spaces that could be used as new development came into the area. Not only as the city was looking to create and renovate the public open spaces, but as private developers were redeveloping and investing in the area to serve as a guide so that all stakeholders were thinking of Kendall Square a little bit more cohesively. And I also, without offending anyone in here, we wanted ideas from more than just landscape architects and designers to do this, because we weren't looking for the design of a specific park or a specific iconic feature here. We were really looking for an overall framework. But how do we put that in an RFP? How is a firm going to respond to that kind of request for proposals? How do we get more than just design firms to respond to that? And how do we really try and encourage more than just the usual suspects to respond to this kind of problem and this kind of opportunity? So we did end up issuing an RFP, but it was for a competition coordinator to run a competition here. We had done some research on competitions that had been done around the country and felt like with land and funding available so that we could see some key pieces implemented early on, with growth anticipated in the area and investment continuing to come into the area, we really had a special opportunity here to start to think really creatively and come up with some innovative solutions to the question of the public realm and the overall open space network. Now, this didn't happen without challenges and considerations, even internally, that we had to spend a lot of time discussing. There was something new for the city, and even staff working most closely on it, including myself, spent a lot of time on internal discussions, doing a lot of questioning of each other, explaining, and research to understand how something like this would actually work in Cambridge. And once we understood it, we had to effectively make the case and in some cases defend the idea to other stakeholders in the process, including city administration, staff from other departments, the general public, and especially the study committee that had already been created and had been meeting for several months to help come up with an open space plan for the area. Another main concern was ensuring that this remained a very public process, and that study committee that I mentioned played a really important role in that sense. They had been meeting already for several months on these kinds of issues. So they were already engaged in the process. They already understood what we were looking for. And once we had buy-in from the study committee, they played key roles in helping develop the competition brief or competition manual, coming up with the disciplines that were important to be reflected in the jury, helping to create the vision and design goals that were really the main guiding document for all of the teams that participated. It was also critical that the process was as transparent as possible and that we were very clear about the role of the public in each stage. The nature of public input was quite different than in a more traditional process, particularly in the first two stages where a lot of the activities, a lot of the recommendations made by the competition jury were basically made outside of the public eye and behind closed doors, which is generally something you'd like to try and avoid, I think, in a city-run process. So it was different for us. And I think the main difference, and I'm running out of time, so I'll wrap up quickly, was having to let go of some degree of control in the process. And we had to be willing to do that and have an outside jury making some key recommendations early on in the process and throughout the process, really, not staff and not the public. So it was important that the jury was objective and represented a range of disciplines and perspectives. And I think that helped this process a lot in terms of trusting the jury to be very objective about the kinds of recommendations and which teams they recommended moving from one stage to another. I think what we got out of it, we were able to get more than just the usual suspects engaged in the process. The nature of the three-stage process allowed for this, similar to the 11th Street Bridge competition. So at stage one, we're really asking for some basic information, team leadership, and a statement of design intent, and some examples of experience. And this allowed some of the more maybe up-and-coming new talent to emerge and submit ideas without having to go through what could be a costly process of responding to an RFP. The second stage of the competition dealt with, placed a lot of emphasis on creating a diverse team and different approaches and experience. And in the third stage, because each of the final four teams in that stage three received a fee, to complete the plan, they were able to be more creative in their approach. They were able to go out there and give us their best ideas, knowing that there were 3 other teams trying to outdo them in terms of innovation and creativity. So I think that helped in terms of what the final results were for the city. We also built into the competition that the city keeps the rights to all 4 of the final plans. So as we're working with Burke Associates to finalize their winning plan, there may be elements of the other 3 plans that make sense to incorporate, and we'll be working with them on this over the next couple of months. I think hiring a competition coordinator, we also hired Don Statsny, a Statsny architect, was helpful, if not essential, for us. He came with a lot of experience and knowledge and a reputation for well-run competitions. And I think that overall the success was due to getting buy-in from everyone involved, from the competition participants to city leadership and staff, to the competition coordinator, the jury, and especially the community in and around Kendall Square in Eastern Cambridge. So we're really looking forward to entering this next phase of implementation. We're looking forward to seeing some of the results of this actually come to life. And thank you. We'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Good afternoon. I didn't make my own slides. I figured I'd just use Taha's. So my name is Inga Saffron, and I come at design competitions from perhaps a different position. I'm a journalist, the architecture critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I'm usually the one waiting outside the jury door with my ear pressed to the door, waiting for the results. And so when I was asked to be on this jury, I was very, very excited to see things from the other side. When I tweeted about this conference today, I promised I would share some secrets, but I think it's more like insights about, just how the process worked. And just to step back, in my experience, as a critic, right, I've written about dozens and dozens of designs, and very rarely, I would say, maybe in 10% are projects chosen with a jury, and in the other 90%, they're usually, in Philadelphia, they tend to be picked either by a political official or an agency that's responsible for the design, like the Parks Department. And it's just astounding to me how little public engagement there is beforehand. And often the public engagement, as Scott mentioned, doesn't take place until after the design team is selected. And I think that has a tremendous impact on the final result. At the same time, one of the things I've noticed lately is that in some cases the public engagement goes overboard, and there's a design process taking place in Philadelphia right now for what's called Love Park, and there's been a lot of very earnest public engagement, and after every session they make a list of the community values and the things people want to see in this redesigned Love Park, which is right near City Hall in Philadelphia. And, somebody wants a playground, someone wants a lawn, they make a list. Anyway, they created an information cloud, and they handed it to the designer, who basically made a diagram. And I'm very concerned that this is not landscape architecture. This is like, translating, the information gathering onto the surface of this park. So when I was asked to serve on this jury, and when I heard about the process, I was very, very excited, because I really liked the way it blended community engagement, which I do think is important and necessary, but created this jury with expertise that would make kind of professional decision, or think about this in an informed, critical way, and then after that, because it is a framework, the winning team would, then be able to be real designers. So I felt it really blended all those important steps without shortchanging any of them. And the other reason I was very excited to be on the jury is because I did spend a year in Cambridge as a Loeb Fellow here at the GSD, and I was familiar with Kendall Square and fascinated and shocked by it, because as Taha described, it is one of those instant places that was largely created by developers and has none of the texture or diversity of uses of neighborhoods that grew up more organically. And I would go there and I would feel really good about Philadelphia, which has some of these instant neighborhoods too, and the architecture wasn't quite as dull. But so I was really interested in this problem, which I think so many reviving cities face, is so many big cities in America have so much vacant land, and now there's a new interest in living in cities and building in cities, and so these places are just like springing up overnight. And so how do you make them feel like real places? How do you plan that when that's not the way cities were built initially? So all those problems really drew me to the competition. As Taha described, these RFPs were put out, or RFQs, and we started with about 45 submissions that were pretty basic, just each of the teams introducing themselves and their philosophy. And we spent a day walking around the neighborhood, looking at all the sites with people from the city, Stuart Dash, and also on our jury was Roger Booth, who was a former head of the planning and urban design part of the city government, and sort of absorb. We walked around. We got a sense of what the streets were like, what these places were like. What was the level of pedestrian activity on the streets. And then we went back and we looked at these 45 submissions and argued about them. And it turned out that we were 5 or 6 really opinionated people, each with our own, niche. We had a landscape architect, we had someone from municipal finance, we had someone who specialized in play, we had a public art person, there was me. And I, as an architecture critic, I write, everything. I cover, everything, from parking garages to very fine architecture, and I write about parks and streets. So we winnowed those down to about 8, and then as Taha said, we asked those 8 to submit more detailed proposals, not going all the way, but just to flesh out more of their ideas. And then we studied those again, and we argued about them, and then we had those 8 teams present to us, and that I felt like that was like it took about a day and a half for those presentations to take place. And I really felt like it was, going through an entire semester's course on landscape architecture in America, because the presenters just, ran the gamut. There were all kinds of ideas and philosophies that were incredibly different. And there was a feeling on the jury that there should be some non-traditional thinking represented. And we were a little nervous about this because there were some really out there submissions and teams. But, since, we were going through a multi-step process, we felt we could incorporate that, some of the more out there teams, because, we weren't committed. At the same time, for me, I can say this speaking personally, because I was on the other side, I really felt this responsibility, almost like I was the client. And, I wanted to hear new ideas, but I also wanted something that was going to work, and a team that was capable of executing it as well. In the end, so we winnowed the 8 to 4, and then they were paid quite a generous sum to really work up a very detailed submission that was about 100 pages each. It wasn't as much as they would have gotten paid if they had the job, but it was enough that they could really do a deep dive into a proposal. And so that was really hard by the time it was 4. But interestingly, the 4 were very different. And I wanted to say, on the jury, there sort of emerged 2 camps. There was one camp that was really interested in the aesthetic design aspects of the teams, of the proposals that the teams had presented, and another that was more interested in things like activation and streets and how these spaces would be used. And we, let's say, argued quite a bit about what should be given precedence. And so by the time we got to 4, and they also made very half-hour presentations, and we read their proposals, at the end of that, I can say personally that I had a favorite. But as we continued to argue, and other people had their favorites, as often happens, I think, in juries, we began to see each other's points. And I don't want to call the winner a compromise candidate, because I think the winner is very, very strong. But I think ultimately that the winner embodies the sensibilities of both camps on the jury. And the other really nice part of this competition, as Taha mentioned, is that because the city owns all 4 plans, we recommended in our jury report that some of the ideas that weren't in the winning plan should be incorporated into the final framework. So I'm looking forward to seeing the result. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. We've had a breach of protocol. We'll have just these 2 panelists first for 10 minutes, and then you guys will come on. But I appreciate your enthusiasm. Thank you both for great presentations that also really tied back to some of Gerald's 6 questions about, do design competitions really add value to all these different sectors? And one of those questions had to do with, do design competitions advance the fields of design and produce innovative ideas? And you alluded to the things that were out there. And I'm curious to have you both discuss more. What were the out there ideas?
I think some of the approaches might have focused more on, I don't want to call any idea too out there. I mean, we wanted thinking outside of the box. We wanted to hear new ideas. We wanted to hear something different than what we might have expected. So I think, things that focused maybe not so much on design of open space or landscape design, and a lot more on how you activate a space, how you program a space. I think some of the, towards the latter stages of the process, some of the proposals really took a very long-term look at some potential ideas regarding the Charles River and different kinds of connections, which may not happen in my time in the city, but and we wanted to make sure that any out there idea, the plan didn't necessarily rely on that, but we encouraged that kind of thinking.
And Inga?
So in the beginning, in the first 8, we did pick a couple of really small firms that had never really executed anything near what Cambridge was hoping to execute. And some, I think there was one firm that was even sort of grassroots activists. I don't even think they were landscape architects.
Probably had some.
Yeah, but we thought they were really interesting and radical, and they were challenging a lot of ideas, and so we included them, and and because there were some architectural historian, landscape architects on the jury, that maybe were more focused on sort of the design of these places, it became, it was kind of challenging for the people who really were thinking about activation and new ways of activating public spaces. And so I think that might have been.
Can you give just one example?
Which firm? Or
no, just the new ways of activating. We don't have to name any names.
So, there were ideas like, using these spaces as community gardens and, having residents help design and activate spaces. They're not that radical ideas, but, they've been tried in other places. But, rather than just simply go out there and design a park, using community people to use them first, and then sort of see how they evolved organically. Yep. That was a sort of a different way of thinking.
Yeah, and certainly just from the I don't know the competition intimately well, but the ideas about the Charles River, and I think it was creating new islands and an archipelago that would serve all kinds of different ecological and habitat functions. That was a pretty big picture, long range vision, without any particular goal of implementing it anytime soon.
Right.
For sure. So of course, those ideas have a lot of value within the design community, but then there's this additional larger sphere of the public that ideally they would be engaged in those ideas. And you guys talked both a lot about public engagement and the ways in which this process as a competition did that. And I thought, Taha, especially it was interesting to hear you talk about the control that as a city official, you have to kind of let go of. I worked for Baltimore City Department of Planning for many years. But what's interesting is I think anytime you do any public engagement, you don't have ultimate, sole control of that process. What made you feel like this one was even more of a letting go than in a typical engagement process?
I think just the really, the overall scheduling and the process itself, how it was run, whether it was the type and nature of public engagement. For instance, we went back and forth with the competition coordinator about what was appropriate to post on our website in terms of what the jury was discussing, in terms of the early submissions from the teams. And we had to hold back on a lot of things because for the integrity of the competition process, teams were maybe and understandably so protective of ideas that they were coming up with. They were still competing against each other. And so there was some balance that had to be struck between the transparency in everything and the actual nature of having a competition like this.
So in some ways, competition limits what you're able to share with the public, or limits the, as you mentioned, it limits the...
It does limit, but I don't want to say it lessens. I think it's a rethinking of how the public's involved, more than saying it, you have less involvement because it's a competition. It's a different kind of involvement. It's at a different stage in the process.
And Inga, you mentioned there was basically like a semester's worth of landscape architecture course embedded within this process and from the team's work. Do you feel like that was communicated to folks who are not landscape architects, who have obviously a stake in this area, but are not trained as designers? And were they able to engage with these materials?
You mean the public?
Sure.
So the public the jury and the public were only together in the same room for the last presentation. And I should say the teams were not just landscape architects.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They were multidisciplinary. I think there was also a session in which the jury was not present when the teams presented to the public, right?
Yep.
I think any community person who went and listened would have learned an enormous amount just about how these kind of spaces get created. You just don't go Inca drawing.
Yeah.
I can say I learned an incredible amount hearing from the different teams and their approaches and how they thought about activating spaces and connecting with history and connections and infrastructure. It was a really valuable learning experience, I think, for a lot of staff in the city. I don't want to speak for anyone else, especially staff with a lot more design experience, but I think it was a valuable experience for us as well.
Timing? Okay. Let me ask you about this, the idea that from the 4 teams you selected a winner, but there could be ideas from the other teams that move forward as well. So that's one way to get around the problem of, does it always have to be about the single winner? On the other hand, were the teams concerned that, this idea that I generated or that we generated as a team somehow now appear in this other team's work? And do we get credit for that? Or what was that dynamic like?
We didn't hear it. I don't know what goes on in their office if there's grumbling about it, but that was the arrangement at the start. And they did get paid for those ideas. So it's not like it was, they were doing it for free or something like that. So.
All right, so thank you both very much. I know we've run out of time, but we have 15 more minutes for a group conversation with the other 2 panelists. So why don't you 2 join us up on stage? Yeah, come on up. And first of all, let me just also thank each of you on behalf of Don Stastny for helping him build that addition on his house. It would not have been possible without those commissions. Any questions from anyone in the audience? There's someone with a mic is making their way up to you. We have 15 minutes, yeah? 10, okay.
One thing that I'm wondering is I'm kind of hearing that to get out of the box or interesting ideas, you need to have an outside process, and that's part of what's good about having design competitions. But I'm wondering if that's, if there's something that city departments or planning processes that already exist, is there something that they can do to learn from that? Is that something that should be internal to public processes already? Or is that something that, I know that there are some city departments that have urban design studios within them. Would that lose the special element of the competition?
Yeah, please.
I think that's an excellent idea. I think we can definitely learn from this kind of process. There are still challenges to doing that. Just the way you go about hiring a consultant, if you're going to do that. There are certain steps that you take, and I think certain, you by nature of their size and resources, certain firms may just have an advantage in terms of responding to a more traditional process. This was an attempt to maybe level the playing field a little bit in terms of different ideas and different kinds of talent out there.
I'll just add one thing to that, is that we had an early conversation as we were working with the DC Office of Planning to see, will this competition be run from the nonprofit that I work for or through the DC Office of Planning? It was always going to be a collaboration, but we intentionally chose to run this through the nonprofit, just because that allowed us to be much more nimble. I think in going through, now that we're building this thing, I'm learning more about the procurement path and contracting than I ever thought I would want to know. But that allowed us, I think, to move a little quicker and be a little bit more nimble in the process.
Can I just go back to that question, though, because I think it's actually really important. If part of the logic behind the competition is, well, this public agency or whatever these entities are not able to get to innovative solutions. The competition is supposed to help them. Ideally, it wouldn't just produce the solution, it was also help that agency understand, well, what were the barriers? What is it about the way we work that prevents this kind of work from being produced? And therefore, we can learn from that and change that and get rid of those barriers, hopefully. And that's very important for us in competitions we're doing now with the National Park Service and the Redevelopment Authority in New Orleans. They want us to also not just produce the solutions, but help them understand, like, what is it that we're not doing productively? And I wonder if the processes you guys went through helped Office of Planning in some way, or helped you guys think through, okay, next time we can take these lessons in how we do other kinds of procurement.
In our case, we right after the competition, we were contacted by the National Capital Planning Commission, it's a federal planning agency in Washington D.C., saying how can we learn from this, right? And we did a debrief with the head of the planning department and the several other folks that I know has shaped a larger competition that they're running for Pennsylvania Avenue corridor, so that we can continue to move that bar forward. Sorry.
No. And so as a community, we kept the momentum going as a result of the competition, seeing how the advantages from having a community-driven, collaborative approach could help us shape the next 30, 100 years of planning and development for our communities. Traditionally, it's just so fragmented based on political will. We wanted to get ahead of the politics by having our own community plan and then offer that. So we've actually produced that as a community, largely because we always felt like our community was kind of left behind in that process. But the competition created a greater range of networks and relationships and access to resources that we normally would not have access to just based on the nature of how the community moves. So it really benefited us and allowed us to think ahead and do the planning to just get all those ideas, accumulate all those out-of-the-box ideas, what are the barriers, and have a realistic idea of what we could produce as a community.
So I'll just add one thing, and I hope you don't mind, Taha. So at a couple points during the jury discussions, especially, when we were rejecting some local firms, familiar firms that had worked a lot in Cambridge, we felt a little pushback from people in city government, because these were people that, the city felt very comfortable with. They were known quantities. And I think the jury played a really big role in, nudging the city to consider some not the usual suspects, and to look at this problem fresh.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
I was hoping to explore a little more the notion of a design competition as a kind of source of a number of ideas. Not all of which are coming from the competition winner, and the other ideas having an ongoing life, and some kind of involvement and or compensation of the non-winning participants. Because I think one of the great things about a competition is you have this whole range of ideas. And I think going back to Marshall's concern of the lack of sufficient compensation, are there other ways beyond the initial payment that people who've been thinking about this could think about as ways to, incorporate that library of ideas and compensate the other parties as those ideas are being used?
Well, I would say that the ideas that came before, the only real solid ideas were presented in stage 3 of the competition. So that was the 4 teams. Before that, teams were just putting together their overall approach and their team disciplines. And I think incorporating what the elements from some of the non-winning plans, I think it's something that's ongoing for us. We're learning how to do that. We'll be discussing that over the next couple of months. But it's an excellent question and a very good point. We want, to keep some of those ideas alive, maybe. So it's something that we're still learning how to do, I think.
And I'd add to that, we're a little different. For similar process, very similar process. But the 4 final teams, actually, we wanted to make sure they retained the rights, the intellectual property to all of their designs. So they own them, and we've encouraged them all to make sure that they're continuing to move it forward. We did a big debrief with each of the 3 teams that didn't win at the end of the process, and all of them said, we'd love to help however we can, right? We have to figure out what that sort of mechanism is, as we're now working with OMA and Alen, but we hope that all of those, not only that process, but actually will collaborate with other ways with all of those really bright folks.
And from my experience in another project that I sat on kind of as a community juror, just to give you a real life example, there was a $2 million fee paid to a consultant to ask the community what we wanted. Now, the same groups, well, not the same groups, but a lot of the groups participated with Scott. So in the process of providing that particular group that was paid that lump sum of money to ask us questions, it was infuriating because they took our intellectual property and packaged it, and we didn't own it. So at the end of the day, there was that money left DC. At the end, that's how we look at it. If it didn't circulate in our community, there was potentially no economic long-term benefit. The difference with the 11th Street Bridge process is that every organization that was at the table has some way to still, in the long term, benefit from the information that was shared. Each designer literally incorporated our ideas in the final design, and we have a way in to be able to use that space, whether you're an environmental organization, a history organization, an art organization like myself, if you're in a social enterprise development business, what have you, there's a road in, and that was a part of that principal process. So we thought about that, and matter of fact, that's the conversation that we're continuing to have as a community on how we make sure that that process continues after the bridge is built.
Okay, we've run out of time, so let me thank again the 4 panelists and also all the panelists from this morning. Thanks for continuing a great conversation. Let me hand it over to Gerald now, who will announce the winners of the student competition that he's been running here at the Design School for the library. Thank you, guys.
So I realize that I stand between all of us and lunch. But this is an important moment, and so what I'd like to do is call upon the full core of GSD 7417 design competitions, a spring term class, all of the students to come down to the front of the room because they are all part of the design competition advisor group. Join me here so that we can, in fact, announce the winners and runners-up of the design competition. So this is right here, please, all of you. It's a very large, see, in order to be a design competition advisor, you have to have a big team. It's a very tough job. And all of us have participated in meeting with the library client, who I will call up in a moment. We debated and drafted the all-important competition brief. I'm trying to advance forward. Here's the design competition, the brief. Open to Harvard Graduate School of Design students only. You register, you submit your entries. Winners announced today, April 24th, 2015. The competition sponsor is the library, and I'd like to call up Ann Whiteside up to here, who's the client who has committed $5 million to realize this project. Borrowing from the Guggenheim, by the way. And we're the advisor. So here's the vision in the brief. It's a much fuller brief, but the brief was prepared, as I said, with the library as client. We wrote it, and it tried to be as open-ended as possible. It was articulated, however, very, very carefully, and I think it's fair to say with relatively few hard restrictions on what the entrants could propose. There would be 2 judgments, a jury decision with a winner and up to 2 runners-up, and a student vote winner, as well as 2 runners-up. And the winner of each of these receives $500. Here's the jury, chaired by Gary Hildebrand, with Grace Law, Bill Ron, Ann Whiteside, and Kyu Sung Woo. This is all online if you want to actually take a look at all of this. So I'm now very, very pleased personally to announce the winners and runners-up, first for the jury, and then at the end I will ask Ann Whiteside to address what this all means, if I can do that at the end. And then I'm going to ask one of my colleagues in the class to announce the student vote winner. I'm happy to say that there are winners for both. It wasn't a requirement to choose a winner, and there are runners-up for both. But the runners-up are just pleasantly honored. This money is coming out of the course budget, by the way. Let's start with the jury decision. By the way, here is the jury contemplating the entries. There's Grace Law gesticulating, and Gary Hildebrand pondering with the entries. That was a 2-hour process. So let's start with the second runner-up of the jury decision. This is Andrew Wade, is that right? Keating, yes, Andrew Wade Keating, who's a Master of Architecture 1 student graduating in 2017. Brutalist Cafe is his entry. One juror liked the theme of taking over the porch without completely impeding access through it. Another juror thought the brutalist pun was clever, but wanted the proposal to take over more of the space on the 100% corner. And still another juror cited the branding and use of the space to showcase special collections. So are you here, Andrew Wade Keating? Congratulations. The first runner-up, Eric Zuckerman, MArch 1, in rare form. One juror praised the atmospheric quality, thought the verticals could be refined and be a nice unit to regularize the facade. Another juror appreciated the duality from inside and outside. A juror noted that it dejunkified, new word, dejunkified the space, allowing for a definitively collective space. Still another noted that it was an evocative rendering. One juror observed that the psychological boundary is still strong within rare form, and the seriality would have a powerful impact from the street. In rare form has a greater sophistication of transformation, said one juror. So Eric Zuckerman, are you here? Congratulations. And now I'm delighted, on behalf of all of us, to announce the winner, who does in fact receive $500, and I'm sure will be delighted to share it with the two runners-up. The winner is Justin Kohler, MArch 1, Advanced Placement 2016 for Library Slide Out. One juror noted that Library Slide Out takes the cover off the library. It was a beautiful provocation. Another juror said that Library Slide Out thought through the problem best and liked the implicit connection to the overall context. One juror thought the idea of a new storefront was refreshing, liked the open-air idea, thought the design broke down boundaries and opened the library and gunned up to the world, and the rendering did a good job of representing that. Another juror saw similarities with the Brutalist Cafe and thought this entry was less commercial and more spatial, and still another juror thought it was an elegant design but pointed out it wasn't useful many months of the year and suggested adding a winterizing element and connection to the lobby space. So Justin, you can take your $500 and do all of that. Are you here, Justin?
Justin's out of town. His buttmate's here.
Justin is out of town. So the two runners-up will now share the, no. All right. You're standing up and accepting on behalf of Justin. All right. Thank you very much, Justin. So let me now turn over to Kate, who will announce the student vote winners. The winner getting $500.
Hi, I'm Kate. So our class, all together, we held a student vote in the library on Tuesday, this past Tuesday, and we had a very impressive turnout from the student body. All told, 128 students came down to peruse the entries and cast their vote in the GSD's first ever course run, and student jury design competition. So on to the winners. Second runner-up, we have Eri Yamagata and Taro Kai. Are they here?
They just left. Can we see their entry?
Okay.
Is there entry on?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's, by the way, that's the student vote. You can see the key role of the cookies in getting that number of students.
There were a lot of cookies, that's true.
All right, so here is the second runner-up.
Yeah, so the second runner-up with their entry, Typology Catalog. First runner-up goes to Timothy Naraki, MLA 1 AP, with his entry, Loeb Library Porch. Is he here? Okay.
Well, we're running late, so.
We'll clap for him anyway. And the winner of the student vote is Justin Kolar, MArc 1 AP with Library Slide Out.
Thank you very much. So that's $1,000 for Justin. And, you know, student elite taste and faculty and professional elite taste merge into one final selection. So let me now turn it over briefly to Ann Whiteside, who's the librarian and has been an absolutely terrific collaborator on this project. Ann, we are so grateful for you. You've been wonderful to the class, and we really appreciate it. So.
Thank you so much. I have to say that this is something I've always wanted to do, is to have a student design competition for a library, because librarians are always talking to students to hear what they think about the library, but to be able to visually see how they think about the library through design is a really fabulous experience. We had this great opportunity to engage with the class, which was also a joy, and to work on the brief and to think about and to help generate the ideas for the competition. We have seen things in all the submissions, I and a lot of the staff who have looked at the competition entries, that we think are really interesting. There are things that were shown that we might not have thought of. I will also say that because of the constraints of the space, there are things that are natural solutions that I've seen amongst some of the submissions, as well as in some of the work we've done with ARO. So that's also validating, in a sense, that the space has certain constraints that we all have to work with. My hope is that we can consider the ideas from the competition entries as we look forward to thinking the next steps for our library, because we are in a process of reimagining and rebuilding the library. It's a several-phase approach, and we're starting this summer on the lower level, and we have more work to do, and obviously the upper level is another space that we'll be working on. And I just want to say thank you to everybody, because this was a great experience. Thanks.
So please do join me in thanking. I'd like to thank my class. They're a terrific class of students, and this is a great thing. Thank you. So we have a half hour for lunch. Please rejoin us at 1:45 p.m. on the dot, and we're back on schedule. Thanks very much.